While the pages and pages of documents reviewed by the grand jury in the Michael Brown case and released to the public this week, a few lines in the testimony of the shooter, police officer Darren Wilson, have gotten some of the most attention. Here's how Wilson describes his initial altercation with Michael Brown. And when I grabbed him, the only way I can describe it is I felt like a 5-year-old holding on to Hulk Hogan. Keep in mind, this is coming from a police officer, just about the same exact height as Brown, though about 80 pounds lighter. Then there's his description of the way Brown reacted to the first shot fired inside the police car. He looked up at me and had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. That's how angry he looked. And then the moment when he says Michael Brown turns back toward him on Camfield Drive after Officer Wilson fired the first volley of shots, quote, at this point, it looked like he was almost bulking up to run through the shots, like it was making him mad that I'm shooting at him. And the face that he had was looking straight through me, like I wasn't even there. I wasn't even anything in his way. Wilson's description of Michael Brown makes him sound almost superhuman. And there's some empirical evidence to suggest this is how black people are often subconsciously perceived by white people.
Many people see, black kids as older than they are, so that there's a loss of innocence of black masculinity and other childhoods. And on the other hand, there's a lack of humanity ascribed to these people. You see both of these forces converging here. The lack of humanity and, in that sense, the denial of the innocence of this, human being.
The academic research actually backs that up, including a series of studies just published in the Journal of Social, Psychological, and Personality Science, which found evidence of what the authors called superhumanization, the attribution of supernatural, extrasensory, and magical mental and physical qualities to humans, and that tendency of white people to subconsciously magnify the powers or strengths of black people. That might explain why the police officer who called in the shooting of 12-year-old Tamir Rice in Cleveland this weekend identified him as a 20-year-old man. Now, let's assume for a second, and I personally think it's safe to assume, that the two cops involved in that horrible, tragic shooting didn't show up on the scene intending to take the life of a 12-year-old boy. But the fact that one of them saw him as a 20-year-old, the way they responded, may very well reflect the subconscious bias underlying their perceptions of Tamir Rice. That bias is at the heart of the issues around policing, Mike Brown, the criminal justice system that have unleashed protests all over the country. And the fact that that bias is subconscious and socially ingrained is what makes it such a deep problem, embedded in the soil of our own society and brain architecture, and what makes it so very lethal. Joining me now, Jelani Cobb, contributor to New Yorker, associate professor, director of Institute for African American Studies at the University of Connecticut, and Monifa Bandele. She's senior campaign director for Moms Rising. This to me is like, there are so many issues stacked up here, but let's just focus on this micro issue of the perception. I want to extend an assumption of good faith to Darren Wilson for a moment, that he is reporting accurately his perception. And in the case of the police officer who called in Tamir Rice, has no reason to lie at that moment that he thinks he's 20. It's going to be found out, right? What do you do about that? Like, people are walking around with these biases. It's been shown in the lab. So then what do you do about it?
If I knew that, the answer to that, I could solve racism. But
well, Jelani, we've got a few minutes here. I've actually.
You're magical and superhuman.
Right,
yes, exactly.
To snap my fingers.
I, as a white person, expect you to have the powers.
This is the Green Mile or the Legend of Bagger Vance, or we could kind of go through the genre. 2008 Barack Obama.
Right.
But I think that it's important to recognize that this has also been a basis for actual policy. You remember the kind of concerns around cocaine was that it would make black men immune to pain and more prone to rape white women. And so, and this is going back to the 1920s, people were kind of saying these kinds of things. And in addition to that, there's also the kind of other side of this, which is that there have been medical studies that show that people give blacks less effective painkillers or lower doses of painkillers because of the presumption that we are somehow or another just more capable of dealing with pain. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And more capable of dealing with pain, more criminal, less human. I mean, all of this is happening in the context of Missouri, where African Americans are 66% more likely to be pulled over by law enforcement than whites. And blacks and Latinos are disproportionately searched after those stops, even though paraphernalia is more likely to be found on whites. So the answer to your question, we don't know. How do we deal with this? But it's there, and it's creating an environment that's very sick and very dangerous.
It's sick and it's dangerous, and I think I don't know. I've talked to a lot of cops and people who work in the criminal justice system, and there's something about that work that also takes those biases and kind of ramps them up in some ways, because a lot of times you are dealing with people at their worst. A lot of you're dealing when you're showing up to a call as a police officer. A lot of times you're showing up to the worst moment of that person's life, right? Like the moment when they're least composed, most angry, most upset, most out of control. And so you're seeing people, particularly if you're in communities in which you're policing people of a different race, right? All you're doing is being exposed to them in a certain kind of context, which seems to then have this kind of reinforcing effect, right? So it all kind of builds upon itself.
But that's the argument for community policing, isn't it? It's like if someone is actually engaged with institutions in the community, you don't necessarily only know the person who has, committed an armed robbery. You know the person who owns the shop, maybe. You know the local pastor, the teachers in the school, the principals, and so on. And you get a more fully developed spectrum of the humanity of the people who live in this place.
And in fact, in the grand jury testimony, you have Darren Wilson talking about going to Canfield Apartments and saying it's an anti-police area.
Right.
Like, he's talking about psyching himself up to go into kind of enemy territory.
But I'm going to push back a little bit, because I don't know that, for example, the police response to students rioting when Joe Paterno was fired on Penn State's campus, right? Students filed into downtown, they knocked down light posts, they turned over the media news van, and they also threw rocks at police officers. And I'm not sure that police officers knew them personally, hung out in the cafeterias, knew the kid from the Commons, but still the response was very different than what you see in Ferguson.
That's a really good point. I want to pose this question to someone who used to be a police officer, be cop in Baltimore, right after this break.